How do you rate the ratings? The television ratings, that is. And that's the subject of today's Austin Faith Dialogue. Please join us.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, welcoming you to this edition. And today we're turning to a subject that is very much with us, because at the beginning of October, the rating system went into effect for the major networks within this country of all of the television programs that are broadcast through that media. At the beginning of September, the first of that month, the 3 hours of requirement by the FCC for the networks to provide educational programs for children went into effect. Now, how do we evaluate this turn and this development in our public policy? And how does that affect people, particularly in the interfaith community? And to rate the ratings, as it were, today we have a real special set of guests with us. We have Dr. John Wright from the University of Texas, director of the Critic program there, which, John, I'm going to try this. This is the Center for Research on the Influences of Television on Children.
Bingo.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to have you here because of confirming that, among other things. And Nancy Jennings, who is a graduate student in the program of Radio, Television, and Film, RTF as it's called at UT.
Yes.
We're delighted to have both of you here because I know that you're doing studies on the effect of television on children, particularly in regard to violence. But because the ratings are so much in the news, and as a preparation leading up to the V-chip that has to do with violence on the media, I think just tell us what you're doing over there at UT along this line.
Well, the first thing I have to tell you about Critic is that violence is not the primary agenda. As far as most of the research community is concerned, we know the effects of violence on children. The news is bad, it's all bad, and it has the bad effects of desensitizing children and making them more aggressive, and that's fully understood now. Only a few Neanderthals in the industry fail to realize that the research community has overwhelmingly shown that.
I see.
So our concern now is to find out what are the redeeming characteristics. Isn't it possible that some of the positive messages that could be transmitted to children, not just the ones by PBS, but by all of the stations, commercial stations, independent stations, network affiliates, and by the cable industry as well,
Right.
might be measurably positive in their effects on children? And Critic has specialized in showing that television is not all bad, that while certainly commercial broadcast entertainment television by and large has negative effects for children, there's a substantial amount of information that when any station, whether it's PBS or whether it's commercial, makes the effort to construct an educational, informative, and positive valued program for children, it has positive, measurable effects. And we in the research community need to do our share to, on the positive side of the ledger,
Right.
as we talk about what's good and bad about American television and how it should be regulated. The bottom line on regulation of television is that you really cannot get the industry to police itself in ways that are counter to its economic interests. That's a fact of life in the capitalistic world.
Okay, and I think the fact that the government has come along with requirements is a growing perception that, like almost any industry or profession, to self-policement is always is limited in its effect.
Well, it's wonderful when they do it, and they do it primarily, all the literature shows that the industry regulates itself most when regulatory controls are more or less threatened by the FCC, or a decade ago it was the Federal Trade Commission that was threatening to regulate because of advertising abuses to children.
Okay, one thing I want to do is, just so our viewers can have a sense of what these ratings are in case they haven't read them in the paper or elsewhere, come to that. But first of all, Nancy, you're in your graduate role there. You're involved in some viewing projects, aren't you? Could you describe those?
Yes, I'm involved in the National Television Violence Study, which is a content analysis of all kinds of television, broadcast, and cable television as well. And we have been specifically here at UT looking at reality programming, which is anything that has to do with documentary style programming or current issues, current events, things that are more of a reality base than a fictional or fantasy base.
I see. And, but in terms, for instance, Saturday morning programs for children,
Right.
do you get into that?
In a different department, we've been looking at the Saturday morning television and seeing how it's changing with these new regulations. And we've been trying to establish different evaluation measures to see if there's cognitive lessons that are being taught or social lessons, and what type of educational and informational.
Okay. I think one thing we want to do is come to that matter of the 3 hours of educational television that's being required of the networks. But first of all, let's look at the ratings as a whole. And John, I know you've done us the favor of bringing us a chart here that shows these, and if we can pull those up, you can maybe give us a quick summary of it.
Okay, well, this first one shows a group of 2 ratings at the top of the screen, you see. Those are for children's programs, and TVY is supposed to be programs that are designed for any children and all children. TVY7 is children's programming, but it's programming that's best understood and most appropriate for children over 7 years of age, or 7 or older.
All right.
Then the ratings for all audiences are the bottom 4 on your screen. They look very much like the Hollywood ratings for films. They're familiar to people. That's one of the good things about them, maybe the only good thing about them. TVG is general audiences, and it means essentially anybody can watch it and it will be harmless. Parental guidance, PG, are programs that require that, and there's a little code mark on that, which I'll explain in a minute. TV-14 are programs which are unsuitable for children under 14. And TVMA means that they are programs for mature audiences and really should be adults or young adults before they see such programming. Now, these are reminiscent of the Hollywood ones. The last 3 of those, TV PG, TV-14, and TVMA, Jack Valenti and the Motion Picture Academy people have finally relented a little bit and given the people what all the polls say they want. Most parents want to be able to choose programming for their children and choose programming for the V-chip when it comes along next year that is based on the content and their judgment of what kind of content their children should see. What the industry wants is to be able to do it by age grading. Let them decide for parents what the appropriate ages are. And this compromise maintains a lot of that for them. But they have agreed, and that's what the little asterisk mark was on that visual you saw a minute ago, that for those bottom 3 ratings, the most restricted 3 ratings, they are willing to put in the letters V for violence, S for sexual content, D for suggestive dialogue, and L for strong or vile or obscene or scatological language.
But they only did that after there was some pressure put on them to do it, right?
They insisted that they were going to be in charge of all of this. And of course, they have a very important reason for doing that. When they were using the preliminary, the Hollywood version, there were no programs rated for mature audiences or there was some parental guidance, but there were the hardest ratings weren't used. When they use TV-14, it's like the R ratings for movies. It manifestly and measurably, and again, the research community finds these things out. It's no longer opinion, it's fact. The Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania has completed a series of studies which show that the PG-type ratings and even more the TV-14 ratings enhance the attractiveness of the show for kids 12 and 13 because they know it has some scatological, racy stuff in it that they'd like to see.
I see.
So, and the networks say, oh my, well, we didn't intend that, but of course they intended to get the biggest audience they could get.
Well, you know,
this is one of the ways they do it.
One of the things I think is clear, because there are these requirements, and because, you know, Bob Dole took after the Time Warner, I think it was, for the rap, and Clinton brought the people, the network people together to move on this Telecommunications Act of '96 to include such ratings and requirements to make good on the educational side. Nancy, it seems to me all of this represents a movement in the country to say to the industry, look, we want you to exercise this great power that you have responsibly. Now you work within, I think you've worked in Del Valley School with parents and so on. Do you sense among parents at the grassroots level, we need some help, we need some support in this part of raising our kids?
I can, from working with the parents at Del Valley, they definitely have an interest in what their children are watching, and that they want to know what's available out there for them. And if an advisory system such as this, or educational and informational icons can help them, then they're more than willing to work with the industry and try to find a good way for them to be able to select the programs that they want to watch for their children to watch.
Yeah. So they've expressed that to you?
Yes, they have.
And it's part of your job to help direct them toward resources that could be useful to them in their parenting?
We're certainly trying.
Yeah, I mean, you're not just trying to dig out research information, but to be practically helpful? Is that?
Definitely.
Definitely. Are you trying to do that at UT? Are you trying to be practically helpful?
Why do you think, Rich, that those two should be any different?
Well, okay.
Good applied research is practical and helpful, and one of the things you want to do is help parents do what they can do. You talked about Dole's criticisms and so on, but when the media are criticized in that way, they always come back and say, fundamentally, it's not up to us, it's up to parents. And I think, you know, in an ironic way, that's fundamentally true, that parents do need to do that. And the way they do it is writing in the comment book of stations so that when relicensing time comes, they must be accountable.
Yeah, every station in Texas next year is up for its license renewal, and there are these logs that are at each station that the citizens can write in their comments.
Yes.
Why don't we just got a minute left, but just make sure we've got that in mind. How does your average citizen or viewer participate in that regard?
Well, I think the most important thing that you can do is when you see something you like, enter it in the log. Call the station, go down there, and see what the comment book has to say, and enter what you want to say in it. You can write to the FCC, but it's much easier. The law provides that the station must keep an open log of your remarks. But what parents really want is a method for rating how much of each category of objectionable material there is on a show. And they've asked for that. The surveys all show they want that. There is a good way to do that, and if there's time, I'd like to tell people. If not,
well, we don't have time this half, but we'll come back to it in the second half. And I think also then, we're going, because Austin Faith Dialogue represents the interfaith community, we'll look at the values that are underlying concerns from that perspective. But in the meantime, folks, we hope that you will come back and join us in just a few moments when we have the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue. Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue, where today we are engaged in a dialogue about rating the television ratings, and particularly how effective the educational requirements are being met by stations for children. I would like John Wright from UT Critic as director of that program, and Nancy Jennings, who is a graduate student in radio, television, and film at UT, to bear with me just for a moment, because in the first half, as we were going out, I said this is an interfaith community that is particularly connected with our show. And I want to tell you about the 10 Commandments of good TV watching, or responsible television, however it might be called. We've asked the folks here at the station to put up on the monitor 5 of these, the first half having to do with having no power higher than electronic or media power higher than that, and no electronic image to be worshipped, etc. This all tracks out with the original 10 Commandments in terms of the first 4 being people's relationship to God. The second half begins to get into more specifically people's relationship with each other, that tracks, for instance, thou shalt not support programs that are dealing with gratuitous violence or promiscuous sex, or even the 10th commandment, like thou shalt not covet, you know, what you see on television commercials in this case. Now, the background of that is that I've been doing media literacy through the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in various congregations. And each time that I do it, I say to parents or to adults, intergenerational, here are the 10 Commandments from Moses' day. How do you apply this as we move toward the 21st century in this world that is saturated with media? And I'd like to, you know, you folks are coming at it from an academic standpoint, but you're also coming to it as persons of conviction and a grandparent and working with parents. Give us a little bit of feedback. Are those the kind of values that represent kind of across the section, whatever faith tradition people may belong to?
It's very hard in America to write a positive set of rules that can be accepted across the board because we are so diverse. Mm-hmm. And my first impulse is to celebrate our diversity and say, that's a good set. Mm-hmm. There's probably a good set that could be written with variations for almost every faith community there is. And what they would have in common are sort of like, you know, the original 10 Commandments turn out to be found in every religion on the planet.
Right.
In
There's
one
a common
form or
ground
another.
there.
There's a common ground. The golden rule is in every religion.
Mm-hmm.
And the golden rule might be a good one to have here. What, Mr. Broadcaster, do you want your children to see? Mm-hmm. I've asked that of a lot of executives at the networks, and they stumble and bumble around and back away from the question. They don't want to answer it, especially in front of the camera. Mm-hmm. I guess what I'm saying is that the value that we espouse as Americans is implicit there in some of your suggested rules, and that is take responsibility for what goes on the TV set in your family. And when you do that, one of the things that happens is you find you need to know, and you cannot know before the program is aired in the current world. Mm-hmm. So just before the State of the Union address by President Clinton in January of 1996, his staff called us and said, the president wants to know, you've been at the White House, talked about these things, and we're calling a lot of researchers to ask this question. Should he mention the V-chip favorably in his State of the Union address? And I said, yes, he should, but he should stress that the hard thing is not the V-chip. The hardware is never the problem. The problem is the software. The problem is the human side. How do you decide what the ratings are for programs? What America is asking for is a V-chip that they can program qualitatively and quantitatively with decisions they make instead of some Hollywood executive.
Okay. Well, I think this brings us back to the point that you were making earlier in terms that it does become ultimately responsibility with parents. And as you have worked with parents and saying, here are some guidelines, what are you want to be positive about this, don't you, Nancy? You don't want to just, critic doesn't mean just criticism. It
Right.
does mean positive. What is it that you can point to, have pointed to, particularly in regard to children's television programs?
Well, we would strongly encourage that parents monitor what their children are watching, and that they be accessible for discussion of what's on the television with their child. I know it's very difficult to try to watch everything that your child is watching, but it becomes especially important when we are considering these ratings of violence, that the parents can be accessible to the child, because it helps to mediate the effects of what they're seeing. If they have a chance to talk it out, it helps a whole lot in being able to understand what's going on and put more of a context to it, more perspective to it.
So talking with the kids. Peggy Charon, who is, or is, I guess, still connected with the, what's the organization, Children's...
Well, it's now become the Center for Media Education.
Oh, okay. But she, I remember her saying that the TLC of, with parenting in a TV age is, the T is for talking to your kids about what they're watching. L is to look at it with them. And C is to choose it for them when they're little and with them as they grow older. And that, that came to mind as you were saying this is what your your message is, it sounds like, to parents.
Definitely.
And what are some of the, you know, the good programs that, you know, that are meeting these educational values? And, you know, you can rate these for us a little bit.
Sure. There's more and more coming onto the screen now that we have the Children's Television Act, which has required the 3 hours of educational television on broadcasting stations. So there has been an increase, and they have been frequently on Saturday mornings at this current time. And I would encourage programs that have more of an informational content, as well as those that have a social message to them. The ones that have more of an informational content would be better for school achievement and school readiness than maybe some of the social content, but the social is important as well. And they've been trying to do a balance on most of the stations.
Our research has shown that, in the past, has shown that, that PBS takes on the tough ones. They teach the science, the math, the hard-nosed 3R type stuff, and that the networks, understandably, because they're competing for audiences still, want to do the things they can do through a fictional medium. So they're doing the social messages and some of the moral messages and the basic ideas that you should keep promises, that you should trust others, that you should be in charge of yourself. Some of these things that you don't have to be religious or any particular kind of religious to know must be good for kids.
Yeah. Well, you know, I also think that there have been some rather flimsy attempts in the past. I don't know if this is currently going on, but they said the Flintstones helped teach people archaeology. You know, I mean,
Flintstones is a particularly difficult example because it was the Flintstones who had on the show the sponsorship of Flintstones vitamins, and kids started taking overdoses of them because they looked like Barney and Fred. It was a very unfortunate move. Mistakes are made, and some of them are honest mistakes, but the response of parents has been overwhelmingly, let us know what's out there. We will do our best to monitor what our kids are doing, but let us see and judge. And it's possible with the V-chip to do something really interesting.
So you're hopeful in that regard.
I'd like to show you something.
Okay, we got another graphic here, I think. If we
This
can.
is a proposal. It's not a formal one yet. Can you...
I think that's as close as we're going to get. Just give us a
maybe
summary
almost
if you
too close.
could.
We've done this with little black shades, but what it says is there are 5 characteristics across the bottom of your screen, and I think you got to zoom out to see them, but they have to do with violence, sexuality, nudity, bad language, and what we call disgusting, which is stuff that isn't, it's just fortuitous. Hollywood does more of it than anybody else. And what those levels were that you saw were levels from all of it's okay to none of it's okay, so it's pulling down a shade. Now what would actually happen is this. When you get a new set after 1998, it will be required to have a V-chip. If this proposal of ours were accepted, and admittedly it's a pure case of what people want, and it'll have to be compromised some to meet before industry will accept it, what parents would see is that entire array, and then the TV would blink at them and say, use your remote control to make the following choices. the violence would be blinking, and they would say, use your volume to control to run the shade up or down on how much violence you want.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you don't know what those 5 points mean yet, but with trial and error, you would come to mean it because the producers would rate the programs.
Well, I think
the same with sex, the same with nudity, the same with the other characteristics. And when you were all done, you would enter a 4-digit code that you made up and punched into the
now,
channels.
how is your average
that
parent going to
would-
learn all that, though?
It's very easy. That anybody who can program their VCR
Aha.
to tape Austin Faith Dialogue when they're out of town.
Oh, I'm sure that there are
Can
many
do
doing
this.
that.
Well, I tested it out on some people, and I assure you that people do not know what the present compromise code means. That research has been done by Amy Jordan at Annenberg School, and it's very, very clear that that people don't understand.
Well, PTAs could take a hand in this in terms of
They could.
at the school level, and churches could do it. This is one reason that through Austin Metropolitan Ministries we've helped develop what's called the Austin Media Literacy Network in association with you folks at UT and at St. Edwards, and the number that we always give at the program, the 472-7627 number, is the means by which anyone looking in that wants to find out how the media literacy process is working in town and be part of that and be in conversation with the station managers. That's what we're aiming to do. And so
Very
that would be one way of communicating with the church community what these ratings are, and some of the values that are underlying the what to look for in the children's side of it. I want to also say that Diane Holloway, I noticed in her preview of the children's programs this fall, it said things are getting better, she thought. I mean, in terms of her evaluation. Have you picked that up too, Nancy, that folks are thinking, well, maybe all of this public input is making a difference?
There's finally hope. Yes, I would say that there has been an increase in the educational programming and also in the variety of programming. You hardly ever saw game shows or
Oh, yeah.
other type of reality type programming for children. It was mostly just cartoon and animation. So I think it's refreshing to see educational as well as a diversity of program types out there.
Take a look at Science Court on ABC, for an example. It's remarkably well done.
And there's your
There are lots of others. That's just one out of the hat.
yeah, okay. And I think that when the television reviewer of the Austin American Statesman, like Diane Holloway, who follows this, is positive about it, that's a hopeful sign. And there's also Diane Dawson, I think is her name, who writes on Saturday or on the Sunday papers about children's, doing some evaluation of those programs. So the newspapers are picking up part of media literacy too. Thank you, John Wright. Thank you, Nancy Jennings, for being with us today. And thank you, folks, for watching on this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. We'll be back again next week and hope you'll be with us too. I'm Richard Thompson for Austin Metropolitan Ministries, and peace be with you.